I was 32 when the blizzard swallowed Highway 212 outside Red Lodge, Montana, and I still can't talk about what happened without feeling the sting of winter in my lungs. I had been driving back from Billings after visiting my sister, stupidly ignoring the storm warnings, thinking I could beat the front. But halfway across the Beartooth foothills, the wind rose like a living thing, snow sweeping across the asphalt in horizontal sheets. My windshield wipers froze mid-stroke. The heater coughed warm air only half-heartedly. Eventually, I had to pull over beside an old turnout, killing the engine to keep fuel. I wrapped myself in a thermal blanket and kept telling myself the storm would pass. But then I saw footprints appearing in the fresh snow 20 feet in front of my car. One by one, toe first, then heel, crisp and deep and forming a slow, deliberate path straight toward me. No figure creating them, no silhouette, nothing. Just steps moving closer with the wind screaming overhead. When they reached the driver's side door, the metal popped inward, like something cold had pressed its weight against it. My breath fogged. A whisper leaked through the seams, sounding like a woman saying my name, though no one should have known I was there. I grabbed my emergency light, flicked it across the snow, and caught a shape standing inches from the glass. Not a woman, not exactly human, more like a faceless form carved from compacted ice, with frost shifting under its surface like veins. It leaned closer, and the window frosted over instantly, forming a crystalline pattern shaped like a handprint. I started the engine even though the oil light glared red, and the thing tilted its head as if disappointed. When the engine roared to life, its face cracked down the middle like splitting ice on a lake, and the entire figure collapsed into drifting snow. I drove blind through the storm for miles until I reached a plow truck and flagged it down. Later, when I returned with state troopers after sunrise, the only prints were mine. But on my driver window, the frost-etched handprint remained, solid, perfect, and impossible to scrape off until the temperature rose above freezing 3 days later. I used to work seasonal maintenance for an abandoned alpine lodge near Lake Placid, the kind of place where the wind felt older than the building itself. The Snow Haven Lodge shut down in the 80s after an avalanche buried half the west wing, but the county still paid a few of us to keep the structure from collapsing completely. I stayed there alone during a 3-day cold spell, mostly clearing ice off the roof line and checking for structural cracks. The first night the power flickered until the backup generator kicked in, casting long shadows from empty hallways lined with broken skis and faded trail maps. Around 2 a.m., while I was sealing a window frame, I heard piano music drifting down from the old ballroom. Slow, simple notes from a long-lost waltz. I followed the sound through the hallway where the temperature dropped so fast my eyelashes froze. The ballroom doors were slightly open, and yellow light spilled across the floor. Inside, a woman in a torn vintage dress stood by the old grand piano, but her feet hovered an inch above the snow-dusted hardwood. She turned toward me and her face flickered between ages, young, then sunken, then skull-like, until it settled on something hollow. As she glided toward me, the snow on the floor recoiled from her steps, as if repelled by her presence. I backed through the doorway, but the temperature plunged so violently I almost blacked out. She whispered, "We never left," and dozens of silhouettes materialized behind her, dancers swaying in jerky, unnatural motions, their limbs bending wrong as if tied to strings made of ice. When the generator sputtered and died, the lights snapped off and the music warped into a screech. I ran from my room, slammed the door, barricaded it with a dresser, and waited out the night with my flashlight dying in my hands. At dawn, the ballroom was untouched, no footprints except my own, but the piano keys were frozen solid, fused beneath a 1/4 inch of transparent ice showing fresh fingerprints underneath, pressed from the inside. I didn't expect to survive the winter I spent in Utqiagvik, Alaska, working as a contractor technician for a private research station built on permafrost. The sun never rose that season, just shifting shades of twilight and darkness. We monitored subsurface vibrations and ice core temperatures, routine work mostly. There were 5 of us on rotation that month, but one night during a whiteout storm, the others went into town for supplies while I stayed behind, repairing a signal relay. Around midnight, I heard knocking from beneath the floorboards. 3 taps, long pause, 3 taps again. The kind of pattern that suggests intention. I checked the ground level access tunnel, but the snowdrift outside was untouched. Wind carving smooth dunes over everything. When I climbed back inside, the knocking turned into dragging sounds, like something moving slowly under frozen earth. The lights flickered as the backup battery wavered. Then a voice crackled through our encrypted radio system. My supervisor, Cole, but distorted, metallic, and wrong. It said, "Open the hatch, something followed us." But I could see from the GPS beacon that their snowcat was still miles away. The dragging under the station grew louder, circling the perimeter, then stopping directly under my feet. The metal floor bent upward once, twice, each impact shaking frost loose from the ceiling. I grabbed the thermal camera from our equipment rack and pointed it at the floor, reading nothing. No heat, no cold anomaly. Just absence. A void. When the station door alarm blared, I sprinted to the hallway and saw a shadow standing inside the airlock. Too tall, bent at the midsection, joints trembling as if adjusting to gravity. I aimed the thermal cam and saw a human-shaped outline but inverted, its body colder than the outer storm, as if radiating negative heat. The creature's head snapped toward me with a sound like cracking ice expanding in a pond. I fled to the comms room and locked the reinforced door. For hours it scratched at the metal, whispering in voices blended from each of my coworkers. By the time the real team returned at dawn, I was half frozen, crying, and barely conscious. They found the airlock door bowed outward, frost etched with lines like desperate claw marks from the inside. The company filed the event as structural pressure damage. But sometimes in dreams I still hear the tapping beneath the floor. 3 knocks, long pause, 3 again. Still waiting for me to open the hatch. Story 2. My name is Ingrid Solheim, and I was 37 years old when I took the caretaker position at the Vargfjell Mountain Lodge in northern Norway, about 60 kilometers inland from Tromsø. I'd been through a divorce that had hollowed me out, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear into a place where the silence could put me back together. The lodge was a historic building, constructed in 1923 as a hunting retreat for wealthy Europeans, and it had passed through various hands over the decades before a preservation society acquired it and decided to keep it maintained year-round, even though guests only came during the summer hiking season. My job was simple. Live there from October through April, keep the pipes from freezing, run the generator, clear the access paths, and file weekly reports. The society provided me with a snowmobile, a satellite phone, emergency supplies, and a modest stipend. I thought I understood what I was signing up for. I thought isolation was the same as loneliness, just quieter. I was wrong about everything. The polar night began in late November, that period when the sun doesn't rise above the horizon for weeks at a stretch. I'd prepared for darkness. I'd brought books and journals and a laptop loaded with films. I'd stocked up on vitamin D supplements and full-spectrum light bulbs. What I hadn't prepared for was the quality of the darkness itself. It wasn't simply an absence of light. It was a presence, a weight that pressed against the windows and seeped through the walls. The lodge had thick timber construction, excellent insulation, double-pane windows with interior shutters, and a wood-burning stove that could keep the main room comfortable even when the exterior temperature dropped to 30 below. I learned to read the building's sounds, the pop and groan of contracting wood, the rattle of wind against the roof, the deep thrum of the generator running in its shed 50 meters from the main structure. I learned which creaks meant settling and which meant I'd left a window unlatched. I thought I'd cataloged every noise the building could make. Then December came, and I discovered there were sounds I'd never heard before. The first incident happened on the night of December 8th. I was sitting by the stove reading a novel when I heard footsteps on the roof. Not the skittering of an animal, not the thump of snow sliding off the pitched surface. Footsteps, deliberate, rhythmic, moving from one end of the building to the other. I set down my book and listened. The steps continued, steady as a metronome, pacing the length of the roof and then stopping directly above where I sat. I told myself it was wind, that some trick of pressure and architecture was creating the illusion of movement. Then something knocked, 3 times, directly overhead, hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow. That deep Arctic cold that burns the inside of your nostrils and makes your eyes water and then freezes the tears on your cheeks. I swept my light across the roof, looking for tracks, for any sign of disturbance. The snow was pristine, unmarked. Nothing had walked up there. Nothing had stood above the main room and knocked. I went back inside and locked the door and sat by the stove until morning, which wasn't really morning at all, just a slightly lighter shade of gray along the southern horizon. I filed my weekly report on schedule and mentioned the sounds. The Society's coordinator, a woman named Elsa Haugen, who worked out of an office in Oslo, wrote back with reassurances. Old buildings made strange noises. The roof was metal in places, and temperature changes caused expansion and contraction. Nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe her. I almost did for a few days. Then the footsteps came back, and this time they weren't alone. It was December 14th, a date I'll never forget because it was the anniversary of my mother's death, and I'd been thinking about her all day. The footsteps started around midnight, that same steady pacing across the roof. But this time, when they reached the center of the building, they didn't stop. They continued to the edge, and then I heard them descend. Down the exterior wall somehow, defying gravity, and then around to the front door. I sat frozen, flashlight in one hand, satellite phone in the other. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then a voice spoke. It said my name. The voice was my mother's. Not an approximation, not a similarity. My mother's voice exactly as I remembered it from childhood, calling me the way she used to when dinner was ready. Ingrid, come in. Ingrid, come inside. Except I was already inside, and my mother had been dead for 15 years. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The voice called again, patient and sweet, and then a third time. Then the footsteps retreated, back up the wall, across the roof, and gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the stove and waited for dawn that never really came. The next morning, I searched the exterior of the lodge with a methodical desperation. I examined every meter of wall, every drift of snow, every possible path something could have taken. I found no tracks, no marks, no evidence that anything had been there at all. The snow around the building was as smooth as if it had been groomed. I called Elsa and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long time, then asked if I wanted to be relieved early. I thought about it. I thought about the divorce and the empty apartment in Bergen and all the reasons I'd come here in the first place. I told her no. I told her I could handle it. I was lying, but I didn't know it yet. The third incident was the one that broke me. It was December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, and I'd been making an effort to be festive despite everything. I'd put up a small artificial tree that I'd found in a storage closet, strung some lights, played carols on my laptop. I was trying to create normalcy through sheer force of will. The footsteps had come twice more since the night my mother's voice had spoken, but each time they'd only paced and then departed, and I'd almost started to think of them as a strange feature of the place, like the popping rafters or the way the wind whistled through the chimney. I was wrong to let my guard down. I was sitting by the window watching the faint aurora playing across the sky when I saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 100 meters from the lodge, and it was watching me. I could tell it was watching because its face was turned toward the window, though I couldn't make out features in the darkness. I grabbed my binoculars, the ones I used for spotting weather patterns, and raised them to my eyes. The figure was still there, motionless, and now I could see it more clearly. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed elongated and joints that bent at angles I couldn't parse. Its skin, or what I assumed was skin, was pale and mottled, somewhere between snow and old bone, and its face was my face. I don't mean it resembled me. I mean it had my face exactly, perfectly, as if someone had taken a photograph and stretched it over a skull that wasn't quite the right shape. The features were there, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes set too far apart, the mouth too wide, the expression frozen in something that wasn't quite a smile. I dropped the binoculars and scrambled back from the window. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed the satellite phone and tried to call Elsa, but the signal wouldn't connect. I tried again, then again. Nothing. The phone showed full battery, showed it was acquiring satellites, but the call wouldn't go through. I ran to the emergency radio and powered it on. Static. Nothing but static, loud and hissing, and underneath it, barely audible, a voice saying my name over and over in my mother's tones. I turned off the radio. I checked the locks on every door and window. I piled furniture against the main entrance. Then I sat in the center of the room with my back to nothing and waited. The knocking started an hour later. Not on the roof this time. On the front door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, the same pattern repeating with mechanical precision. And with each set of knocks came a voice. My mother's voice, asking to be let in, telling me she was cold, telling me she'd missed me, telling me to open the door. Just open the door. Why wouldn't I open the door? I didn't answer. I sat with my hands pressed over my ears and I didn't answer. The knocking went on for hours. 3, 4, 5 hours, never stopping, never varying, while the voice cycled through every phrase my mother had ever said to me, every endearment, every expression of love, all of it repeated in that patient, gentle tone that was exactly right and completely wrong. Then, around what my watch said was 4 a.m., the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it hurt my ears. I sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Then a sound came from inside the lodge, from the hallway that led to the bedrooms, footsteps, not on the roof, inside. I turned and saw it standing at the end of the hallway, the thing with my face. It was inside the lodge and I didn't know how, and it was looking at me with my own eyes, and it was smiling with a mouth that had too many teeth. It raised one elongated arm and beckoned to me, a come here gesture, the gesture my mother used to make when I was a child and she wanted to give me a hug. I ran. I grabbed my emergency kit and my parka, and I ran out the back door into the killing cold. I ran to the snowmobile and I climbed on and I started it and I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove away from the lodge into the darkness, the cold tearing at my face, the engine screaming beneath me. I made it to a ranger station 18 kilometers away. I was hypothermic, had stage 2 frostbite on 3 fingers, was borderline incoherent. The ranger who found me, a man named Christian Berg, thought I'd had a breakdown from isolation. He warmed me up, treated my injuries, called for an evacuation helicopter. I tried to tell him what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. He gave me sedatives and I slept. The society sent a team to investigate the lodge 3 days later. Nothing unusual. No signs of intrusion, no damage, no tracks in the snow. The locks were intact. The furniture I'd piled against the door was back where it belonged. My personal effects were neatly arranged in the bedroom I'd abandoned. The only thing out of place was the artificial Christmas tree, which had been moved from the main room to the center of my bed, its lights still blinking. I didn't go back. I resigned from the position and returned to Bergen and spent 3 months in therapy trying to process what I'd experienced. The official explanation, the one Else and the society accepted, was that I'd suffered a stress-induced psychotic episode exacerbated by the polar night and my pre-existing emotional state. I accepted this explanation publicly because I needed to keep functioning, needed to hold on to some semblance of a normal life. But I know what I saw. I know what spoke with my mother's voice. And sometimes in the deepest part of winter, when the nights are longest, I hear footsteps on my apartment roof in Bergen, where there is no roof to walk on. And I know that whatever found me in that lodge hasn't forgotten where I went. Story 3. My name is Warren Bickle. I'm 54 years old, and I've been operating snowplows for the Minnesota Department of Transportation for going on 26 years. Most of that time I've worked the northern routes. Highway 53, up toward Ely, 169 down to Grand Rapids. The back roads that connect the little towns nobody thinks about except when they need their roads clear. I know winter driving better than I know my own face in the mirror. I know how snow behaves at different temperatures, how wind creates drifts that can bury a car in minutes, how black ice forms on bridges and overpasses before anywhere else. I know what cold does to engines and hydraulics and human flesh. I thought that knowledge made me safe. The winter of 2019 taught me otherwise. It started in early January, right after a series of storms had dumped 3 feet of snow across the Iron Range, and then a polar vortex had locked in temperatures of -30 for days at a stretch. The kind of cold where your truck's diesel gels if you let it sit too long, where exposed skin starts to freeze in under a minute, where the air itself feels like broken glass going into your lungs. I was running a late-night route on County Road 5, a 2-lane blacktop that winds through national forest between Biwabik and Tower. Nobody lives out there except a few hardy souls in cabins, and a lot of wolves and moose. It's the kind of road where if you go off into the ditch, nobody might find you until spring. I was about halfway through my route, maybe 11 at night, when my radio started acting up. The county dispatch operates on a dedicated frequency, and we keep in touch through the shift, reporting conditions and locations, making sure everyone comes home at the end of the night. But that night, the radio started picking up something else. A voice, faint and fragmented, underneath the normal chatter. At first, I thought it was crosstalk from another frequency, maybe the State Patrol or the Forest Service. Then I realized it was saying my name. I adjusted the squelch, tried to clear the interference. The voice got clearer instead of fading. It was a woman's voice, high and thin, and it was repeating my name with a cadence like a nursery rhyme. Warren Bickle, Warren Bickle, Warren Bickle, over and over. I keyed the mic and asked dispatch if they were getting any weird signals. Gina Larson, who was working the board that night, said she wasn't hearing anything unusual. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, just radio ghosts. We both laughed a little. Radio ghosts were a known phenomenon in the range. Something about the iron ore deposits and the geography that made signals behave strangely. I pushed on, blade down, clearing a path through the fresh drifts. The snow was that dry, powdery kind that blows around like sand in the desert, and the wind was pushing it across the road faster than I could move it. My headlights barely cut through the white, and I had to navigate by feel as much as by sight, keeping the truck centered between the tree lines on either side. The temperature gauge on my dash said -32. The heater was blasting, and I was still cold. I came around a curve near mile marker 47 and saw someone standing in the road. I hit the brakes hard, felt the truck slide, corrected instinctively, and came to a stop maybe 20 feet from the figure. It was a woman dressed in what looked like a summer dress, barefoot, hair hanging in wet strings around her face. She was standing in the middle of my lane, not moving, not reacting to the truck or the lights or the cold that should have killed her in seconds. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Nobody could survive out here dressed like that. Nobody could even stand upright for more than a few minutes before hypothermia took them down. But she was standing, and she was looking at me, and then she started walking toward the truck. I radioed dispatch, told Gina I had a possible stranded motorist, requested backup. She acknowledged and said she'd send someone from Tower, but they were at least 40 minutes out. I said I was going to try to make contact, try to get the woman into the truck before she froze. Gina told me to be careful. I said I would. I grabbed my emergency kit from behind the seat, which included thermal blankets and hand warmers and a thermos of hot coffee, and I opened the door. The cold hit me like a wall, instantly freezing the moisture in my nose, making my eyes water. I stepped down from the cab and called out to the woman, asked if she was okay, told her I was going to help her. She stopped walking. She was maybe 10 feet away now, close enough that I could see her more clearly in the headlights. Her skin was blue-white, the color of frost, and her eyes were open but didn't seem to see anything. Her lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. I took a step toward her and she took a step back, maintaining the distance. I took another step. She took another step back. I stopped. Then she smiled. It was the worst smile I've ever seen. Not threatening, not cruel, just wrong. A smile that didn't fit her face, that seemed to pull at muscles that weren't meant to move that way. She raised one arm and pointed at something behind me. I turned to look. There was nothing there, just the road and the snow and the darkness. When I turned back, the woman was gone. Not retreated into the trees, not walked away. Gone. Vanished. The only signs she'd been there at all were the footprints in the snow, bare feet in powder, leading from somewhere in the forest to the spot where she'd stood and then ending abruptly. I got back in the truck. My hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. I radioed Gina and told her the subject had fled into the woods, that I couldn't pursue on foot in these conditions. She acknowledged and said she'd notify the sheriff's department. I sat there for a few minutes, heater blasting, trying to convince myself that I'd seen a hypothermia victim in a fugue state, that she'd wandered off while I wasn't looking, that there was a rational explanation for all of it. Then the radio started up again. The woman's voice, clearer now, no longer saying my name. Now it was saying something else. It was saying, "Them there in the ice, they're still in the ice," repeating it over and over like a prayer or a warning. I shut the radio off. I finished my route without turning it back on. I didn't tell anyone what I'd heard. 2 weeks later, I was back on County Road 5. Same route, same hours. The weather had warmed slightly, up to -15, practically tropical for January in the range. I'd almost convinced myself that what I'd experienced had been a hallucination, some combination of fatigue and cold and isolation playing tricks on my mind. Then I reached mile marker 47 and saw the car. It was off the road, nose down in the ditch, half buried in snow. Old model, maybe from the 60s, a big American sedan with tail fins and chrome trim. I stopped and radioed dispatch, reported the vehicle, requested a tow truck. Then I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down to check for occupants. The car was empty. The doors were frozen shut, but I could see through the windows that there was nobody inside. The interior was pristine, no damage, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just an empty car in a ditch, like it had been placed there carefully. I walked around to the front, brushed snow off the hood, and looked for damage. There was none. The car was in perfect condition except for being half buried in a drift. Then I noticed the license plate. It was a Minnesota plate, but the format was old, the kind they stopped issuing in the 70s. I wrote down the number and went back to my truck to run it through dispatch. Gina came back a few minutes later, voice strange. She said the plate was registered to a 1962 Chevrolet Impala, owner listed as Margaret Ida Embarrass, reported stolen in February 1973. The case had never been closed. I stood there in the cold, looking at a car that had been missing for almost 50 years, sitting in a ditch like it had just pulled off the road yesterday. The snow around it was undisturbed. There were no tracks, no signs of how it had gotten there. It was just there, waiting, like it had been waiting a long time. The sheriff's department came out the next day to investigate. They towed the car, ran tests, tried to figure out how a vehicle missing since 1973 had shown up in a snowbank looking like it had just rolled off the dealer's lot. They never found an answer. The case is still open, filed under unexplained circumstances. Nobody talks about it much. But I talk about it. Not to authorities, not officially, but to other plow operators late at night when the routes are long and the radio static sounds like voices. Because I wasn't the only one who saw things on County Road 5 that winter. Dave Hakala saw a man walking on the frozen surface of Lake Vermilion, walking out toward the center where the ice was thin, and when Dave tried to follow him with his spotlight, the man just faded like morning mist. Paula Christensen heard children laughing in an abandoned logging camp, a place that's been empty since the 1940s, and when she went to check, she found small footprints in the snow that circled her truck 3 times and then disappeared. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what the cold preserves or what it releases when the temperatures drop low enough. But we know there's something in the deep woods, in the frozen lakes that remembers, that waits, that comes out when the world gets quiet and white and still. Margaret Ida's body was never found. She was 23 years old when she disappeared, last seen leaving a bar in Virginia on a February night in 1973. Nobody knows what happened to her. But sometimes, when I'm running that route late at night, and the wind is blowing the snow sideways, and the radio starts picking up voices that shouldn't be there, I think about a woman in a summer dress standing in the road, pointing at something I couldn't see, smiling a smile that didn't fit her face. And I wonder if she ever made it out of the cold, or if she's still out there, still waiting, still trying to tell someone what happened to her on that winter night 50 years ago. Story 4. My name is Dr. Yuki Tanaka. I was 41 years old, and I was the station physician at Concordia Research Station in Antarctica during the 2018 winter over season. Concordia sits on the Antarctic Plateau at an elevation of 3,233 meters, one of the most isolated and extreme environments on Earth. During winter, when the last plane departs in February and doesn't return until November, the station population drops to 13 people who are completely cut off from the outside world for 9 months. The average temperature is minus 50 Celsius, occasionally dropping to minus 80. The air is so thin and dry that breathing feels like swallowing needles. The sun disappears in May and doesn't return until August. I'd trained for years to work in extreme environments, had done rotations at McMurdo and Palmer, had published papers on the physiological effects of polar isolation. I thought I was prepared for anything Concordia could throw at me. I wasn't prepared for what we found beneath the ice. The incident began in late June, 3 weeks into the polar night. One of our glaciologists, a German researcher named Klaus Heidemann, had been analyzing ice cores from a drilling project completed the previous summer. The cores went down nearly 3,000 meters, sampling ice that was over 1 million years old. Klaus was meticulous, methodical, exactly the kind of person you want handling samples that took years and millions of dollars to collect. So when he came to me one evening, looking shaken, I knew something was genuinely wrong. He showed me one of the core samples, a cylinder of ice about 10 centimeters in diameter, taken from approximately 2,800 meters down. The ice at that depth is compressed and dense, ancient air trapped in bubbles that haven't seen sunlight since before humans existed. This particular sample was different. There was something in it, not air bubbles, not sediment, not any of the normal inclusions you find in deep ice. Something else, something that looked organic. I examined it under a microscope. What I saw was a network of thin filaments, almost like veins or nerves, running through the ice in branching patterns. The filaments were dark, almost black, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I couldn't identify the material. Klaus couldn't either. We decided to thaw a small section for analysis. The station had a biological containment lab, standard equipment for research that might involve ancient microbes or other preserved material. We followed protocols carefully, working in full protective gear, taking every precaution. We placed a fragment of the sample in a sealed container and gradually raised the temperature. What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about biology. The filaments began to move. Not just float or settle, but move. Deliberately, purposefully, extending and contracting like the tendrils of a plant seeking light. Within minutes, they had completely infiltrated the nutrient medium we'd provided, growing at a rate that should have been impossible. I sealed the container immediately, and we retreated from the lab. Over the next few days, we ran every test we could think of. The material wasn't cellular in any conventional sense. It had no DNA, no RNA, no proteins we could identify. It didn't respond to any antibiotic or antifungal we tried. It seemed to gain energy from temperature differentials, growing faster when we tried to freeze it, and slowing only when we brought it to exactly minus 50 degrees, the ambient temperature of the ice it had come from. Klaus hypothesized that it was some form of extremophile, an organism adapted to conditions so far outside normal parameters that our standard biological concepts didn't apply. I wasn't sure it was an organism at all. I wasn't sure it was from Earth. We kept our discovery contained, communicated only with the station commander, a French engineer named Capitaine Louis Deschamps. He was a practical man, not prone to flights of fancy, but even he seemed disturbed by what we showed him. We agreed to maintain strict containment protocols and continue observation without indeed attempting further thawing. We also agreed not to tell the rest of the crew until we had more information. That was our first mistake. The second mistake came 3 days later when I discovered the seal on the containment vessel had failed. Not broken, not degraded, failed. The material had somehow compromised it, eaten through it, escaped. By the time I realized what had happened, the filaments had spread through the ventilation system of the lab module. I initiated a full lockdown, sealed the module from the rest of the station, and began emergency decontamination procedures. That night, the whisper started. At first, I thought it was wind. Concordia sits on the flattest, most featureless landscape on Earth. And the wind there has a quality unlike anywhere else. A low moan that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But this was different. This was inside, in the walls, in the floor, in the ceiling. A sound like thousands of voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Words that almost made sense. Patterns that almost resolved into meaning, but never quite. Klaus heard it too. So did Louis. We checked the ventilation system, the heating ducts, every possible source of the sound. Found nothing. The whispers continued, growing louder as the days passed, until I could hear them even with earplugs in, even with my hands pressed over my ears. They were inside my head. Then the hallucinations began. I was in my quarters on the night of July 15th when I saw my daughter standing in the doorway. My daughter Emmy, who was 12 years old, who was in Tokyo with her father, who couldn't possibly be in Antarctica. She was wearing her school uniform and she was crying, and she said, "Mama, Mama, help me. I'm so cold." I reached for her, and my hand passed through her, and she was gone, and I was alone in my quarters screaming. Klaus saw his brother, who had died in a climbing accident 10 years earlier. Louis saw his wife, who was alive but 7,000 kilometers away. Others began reporting similar visions, loved ones appearing and vanishing, voices calling their names in the darkness of the polar night. The station's psychologist, a Swedish woman named Dr. Astrid Lindgren, initially attributed it to shared psychosis, a known phenomenon in isolated groups under extreme stress. Then she saw her mother, who had died giving birth to her, and she stopped trying to explain it. I went back to the contaminated lab module. I don't know why. Some compulsion, some need to understand. The filaments had spread throughout the space, covering the walls and ceiling in a network of dark tendrils. They pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like breathing. And in the center of the room, where the containment vessel had stood, there was something else. A shape that wasn't quite solid, wasn't quite gas, a darkness that seemed to bend light around it. It had no features I could identify, no face, no eyes, but I knew it was watching me. I knew it was aware. It spoke to me, not in words, not exactly, in impressions, images, feelings that bloomed in my mind like flowers made of ice. It showed me what it was, not an organism, not a creature, a memory. The memory of something that had existed on Earth long before life as we know it, something that had been frozen into the ice when the Antarctic plateau was still forming, something that had waited in the darkness for millions of years. It was hungry, not for food, for connection, for warmth, for the minds it could touch and the memories it could taste. It had already tasted us. Every vision, every hallucination, was it feeding on our memories of the people we loved, taking the shape of our longing and using it to draw us in. The filaments weren't just spreading through the station. They were spreading through us, through our thoughts, through everything that made us human. I sealed the lab module with myself inside. I used the emergency protocols, the ones designed for catastrophic containment failure, the ones that weren't supposed to be triggered without authorization from the French Polar Institute. I didn't ask for authorization, I just did it. The seals engaged, the module's air supply switched to internal reserves, and I was locked in with the thing in the ice. I spent 3 days in that module. The whispers never stopped. The visions came and went, Emmy crying in the corner, my mother calling my name, my father sitting in his chair reading a newspaper as if nothing was wrong. The thing watched me, waited, tried different approaches. It showed me what it could offer: connection, belonging, an end to loneliness. All I had to do was let it in. I didn't let it in. I don't know how I didn't. I think about it sometimes, about how easy it would have been to just stop fighting, to just let the cold take me. But something in me refused, some stubborn spark that wouldn't go out. On the third day, the emergency team broke through. Louis had contacted the Winter Over coordinator via satellite, had explained what was happening, and they'd authorized an emergency breach. They found me sitting in the center of the module, surrounded by dead filaments, The darkness that had been watching me collapsed into something like ash. The cold had killed it, or I had killed it, or it had simply withdrawn. I don't know which. The filaments throughout the station had died too, turning brittle and crumbling at the slightest touch. I was evacuated to Christchurch on the first flight out in November. I spent 4 months in a psychiatric facility, being assessed for trauma-induced psychosis. The official report lists the incident as a shared delusional episode triggered by extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. The ice cores were destroyed on orders from the French and Italian polar programs. Klaus left research entirely and went back to Germany. Louis retired. Astrid never worked in Antarctica again. But I know what we found. I know what's down there, in the ice, in the darkness, waiting. It's not dead. It's not gone. It's patient. It's been patient for millions of years, and it can wait millions more. And someday when the ice melts enough, when someone drills deep enough, when the right combination of circumstances brings it back to the surface, it will wake again. And this time there might not be anyone stubborn enough to say no. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the room is very quiet, when the air is very still. They're faint now, barely there, like a radio signal from very far away. But they're not gone. They'll never be gone. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see something moving in my eyes. Something dark. Something waiting. I don't tell anyone this. I don't expect anyone to believe me. But I'm writing it down because someone should know. Someone should be warned. There are things in the cold places of the world that don't belong to the world as we understand it. Things that have been waiting longer than we can imagine. Things that are very, very hungry. And they know our names. Retriclaude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Story 5. My name is Colum Driscoll, 58 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a winter road patrol officer for the Wyoming Department of Transportation, running routes across the Wind River Range and up through the Absaroka Mountains. I grew up in Dubois, a town of maybe 900 people, wedged into a valley where the wind comes screaming down from the peaks and the snow piles so high you can lose a pickup truck in a drift overnight. I knew cold the way most people know their own hands. I knew what it did to engines and bodies and minds. I knew how fast a clear night could turn into a whiteout, how a road that seemed solid could be hiding black ice that would send you spinning into oblivion. I thought that knowledge was enough. I thought understanding winter meant I had some kind of mastery over it. The night of February 3rd, 2017, showed me how wrong I was about everything I believed. The storm had been building for 3 days, one of those cyclonic systems that parks itself over the mountains and just keeps dumping snow until the world disappears. We'd already closed Toguti Pass and most of the secondary roads, but Highway 26 between Dubois and Morin Junction was still technically open, and my job was to run it every 4 hours, checking for stranded vehicles and keeping an eye on conditions. My patrol vehicle was a 2015 Ford F350 with a plow attachment, 4-wheel drive, studded tires, and enough emergency equipment to survive a week if I had to. I'd driven that road in conditions that would make most people weep. I wasn't afraid of snow. I left the station at 2200 hours, temperature reading -24, winds steady at 35 miles per hour with gusts up to 50. Visibility was maybe a quarter mile when the gusts let up, essentially zero when they didn't. I was alone on the road, which wasn't unusual for conditions like that. Anyone with sense was home by a fire, waiting for the storm to blow itself out. I had the radio tuned to dispatch, checking in every 30 minutes per protocol. The dispatcher that night was a young woman named Casey Beaudoin, maybe 25, relatively new to the job, but steady under pressure. We'd worked together enough that I trusted her judgment. I was about 12 miles out of Dubois, climbing toward the pass when I saw the first light. It was off to my left, maybe 200 yards from the road, a pale blue glow that seemed to hover just above the snow. At first I thought it was a reflection, maybe my headlights bouncing off ice crystals in a weird way. Then I realized it was moving, drifting slowly through the storm, parallel to the road, keeping pace with my truck. I slowed down, tried to get a better look. The light wasn't attached to anything I could see. No vehicle, no structure, nothing. Just a glow, about the size of a basketball, floating through the blizzard like it belonged there. I radioed Casey and asked if there were any reports of aircraft in the area, any search and rescue operations I should know about. She said negative, nothing was flying in these conditions. I told her I was seeing something strange, maybe some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. She said to document it and continue patrol. I said copy that and kept driving. The light stayed with me for the next 3 miles. Never got closer, never fell behind. Just drifted along out there in the white like it was watching me. Then as I came around a curve near Breccia Cliffs, it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the storm. I felt a strange sense of relief, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. I focused on the road and pushed on. That's when I saw the car. It was pulled off on the shoulder, half buried in a drift, hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow. I pulled up behind it, hit my emergency flashers, and radioed Casey that I had a possible stranded motorist at mile marker 23. She acknowledged and asked if I needed backup. I said I'd assess and report. Then I grabbed my flashlight and my emergency kit and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical assault, wind-driven snow stinging every exposed inch of skin. I pulled my balaclava up, tugged my hood down, and fought my way to the car. It was a Subaru Outback, older model, Wyoming plates. The engine was off and the interior was dark except for the dashboard lights, which were flickering erratically. I knocked on the driver's window and called out, identifying myself as road patrol. No response. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The driver was a woman, maybe mid-30s, slumped against the steering wheel. For a horrible moment, I thought she was dead. Then she stirred, lifted her head, and looked at me with eyes that didn't quite focus. Hypothermia, I thought. Moderate to severe based on the confusion and lethargy. I needed to get her warm immediately. I got her out of the car, half carried her to my truck, got the heater blasting, and wrapped her in thermal blankets from my kit. She was mumbling something I couldn't make out, syllables that didn't form words. I radioed Casey and reported that I had a hypothermia victim, female, responsive but disoriented, requesting medical at the Dubois Clinic. Casey said she'd have them standing by and asked for my ETA. I said 30 minutes if conditions held. I was about to pull out when the woman grabbed my arm. Her grip was stronger than it should have been, given her condition, and her eyes had cleared slightly. She looked at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, and she said very clearly, "Don't follow the lights." I asked her what she meant. She said she'd been driving when she saw lights in the storm, blue lights, and they'd seemed to be leading her somewhere, and she'd followed them off the road and into a drift, and then they'd gone out and left her in the dark. She said she'd seen things while she was waiting for help. Shapes in the snow, figures that weren't quite human. She said they'd been watching her, circling her car, pressing their faces against the windows. She said they'd whispered to her, told her things about herself that nobody else could know. I told her she'd been hypothermic, that the cold could cause hallucinations, that she was safe now, and I was going to get her to medical help. She shook her head, still gripping my arm. She said they were still out there. She said they'd followed her. She said they were following me now. I looked out the windshield into the white chaos of the storm. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then at the edge of my headlight beams, I saw movement. Shapes, like she'd said. Figures that seemed to be made of snow itself, shifting and reforming as the wind blew through them. They had no features I could make out, just suggestions of limbs and torsos and heads. But they were moving with purpose, circling the truck the way she described them circling her car. I put the truck in gear and drove. I drove faster than I should have in those conditions, fighting to keep the vehicle on the road, watching the shapes in my mirrors as they kept pace with me. They didn't fall behind, didn't tire, just drifted along in my wake, patient and persistent, like they had all the time in the world. The woman was crying softly, face buried in the thermal blankets. I radioed Casey and told her I was coming in hot, told her to have the clinic ready, told her something was wrong, but I couldn't explain what. She asked what I meant by wrong. I said I didn't know. I said just have someone there. We made it to Dubois. The shapes fell away as we entered town, dissolving back into the storm like they'd never existed. I delivered the woman to the clinic, watched them take her inside, then sat in my truck in the parking lot with the engine running and my hands shaking so badly I couldn't grip the steering wheel. The woman's name was Rebecca Home. She was a freelance photographer from Jackson, had been driving back from a shoot near Yellowstone when the storm caught her. She was treated for hypothermia and frostbite and released 2 days later. I visited her before she left, asked her about what she'd seen. She looked at me for a long time without speaking, then said she didn't remember much. Said the cold had done strange things to her head. Said she was grateful I'd found her. I knew she was lying. I could see it in her eyes, the same thing I'd seen in the truck. Terror she was trying to bury beneath normalcy. But I didn't push. I understood. Some things you can't talk about, not because people won't believe you, but because saying them out loud makes them more real than you can bear. I kept working that route for another 4 years before I retired. I saw the lights 3 more times during that period, always in storms, always at night. I never followed them. I never stopped to investigate. I just drove, eyes forward, radio on, focused on getting where I was going and getting back home. But sometimes, in the deepest part of winter, when the wind is howling and the snow is falling so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face, I dream about those shapes in the storm. I dream about following the lights, about letting them lead me off the road and into the white. And in the dreams, I find out where they go. I find out what's waiting out there, in the places the storm hides. I always wake up before I see it clearly. I think that's the only thing that's kept me sane. Story 6. My name is Miriam Voss, and I was the emergency caretaker for a ski resort called Whitefall Lodge in the Chugach Mountains of Alaska during the winter of 2020. The resort had been scheduled to open that November, but a series of financial problems and permitting issues had delayed everything, and the owners needed someone to stay on site through the winter to prevent vandalism, maintain the buildings, and keep the access road clear enough for occasional inspections. I was 29 years old, recently divorced, and looking for a reason to disappear from my life for a while. The job paid well and promised solitude, 2 things I desperately wanted. I should have wondered why they were having so much trouble finding someone to take the position. I should have asked more questions about what had happened to the previous caretaker. I didn't ask. I was too eager to run away from everything I was leaving behind. The lodge sat at about 3,500 feet elevation, accessible by a single gravel road that had wound up from the valley floor through dense spruce forest. During summer, it was a 90-minute drive from the nearest town. During winter, with the road buried under 6 feet of snow, it might as well have been on the moon. My only connection to the outside world was a satellite phone and a radio that could reach the Forest Service station 40 miles south. The owners had left me with a snowmobile, a generator, 3 months of provisions, and detailed instructions on maintaining the buildings. They'd also left me with a locked room on the 3rd floor of the main lodge that I was explicitly told never to enter. I asked about the room, of course. The owner, a man named Henderson, who spoke to me over the phone from his office in Anchorage, said it contained equipment for a ski lift that had never been installed, machinery that was delicate and expensive and not my concern. He said the key had been lost years ago, and there was no reason to break down the door. He said to just pretend it wasn't there. Something in his voice told me he was lying, but I needed the job too much to push. I agreed to his terms and moved in on November 15th. The first month was peaceful. The solitude I'd craved settled over me like a warm blanket, and I spent my days doing maintenance work and my evenings reading by the fire in the main lodge's great room. The building was beautiful in a rustic way, all exposed timber and stone fireplaces and windows that looked out over a frozen valley. The silence was absolute, broken only by wind and the occasional crack of trees settling under their burden of snow. I started to believe I'd made the right choice. I started to feel like I might actually heal from everything that had happened in my marriage, from the betrayals and the lies and the slow erosion of everything I thought I knew about love. Then in mid-December, I started hearing sounds from the 3rd floor. At first it was just creaking, the kind of noise old buildings make when temperature changes stress their joints. I ignored it. Then it became footsteps, soft and irregular, pacing back and forth in the locked room. I told myself it was animals, maybe a squirrel or a marten that had found its way into the walls. I set traps in the accessible parts of the building, checked for entry points, found nothing. The footsteps continued, always at night, always stopping when I climbed the stairs to investigate. On December 23rd, I heard something else. A voice. Faint, muffled by the locked door, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice singing something slow and sad in a language I didn't recognize. I stood outside that door for 10 minutes, listening, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Then the singing stopped and a different sound started. A scratching, like fingernails on wood, coming from the other side of the door, right at the level where someone's hand would be if they were trying to claw their way out. I called Henderson. It took 3 tries to get through, satellite phones being unreliable in bad weather, but I finally reached him and told him what I was hearing. There was a long silence on the line, so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then he said very quietly that I should stay away from that room. He said some things were better left alone. He said if I wanted to keep my job and my sanity, I would stop listening at that door and pretend I'd never heard anything. Then he hung up. I should have left. I know that now. I should have packed my bag and taken the snowmobile down the mountain and never looked back. But something held me there. Some combination of stubbornness and curiosity and the desperate need to prove that I wasn't the kind of person who ran away from things anymore. I'd spent my whole marriage running away from problems, avoiding confrontation, letting things fester until they exploded. I wasn't going to do that again. I was going to face whatever was in that room. I found a fire axe in the maintenance shed and I broke down the door. The room behind it was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a single window that had been boarded over from the inside. There was no ski lift equipment. There was no machinery. There was a bed, a small wooden chair, and walls covered in writing. Thousands of words scratched into the wood with something sharp, covering every inch of surface from floor to ceiling. The same phrase repeated over and over in increasingly frantic script. She's still here. She's still here. She's still here. In the corner behind the bed, I found a journal. It belonged to the previous caretaker, a woman named Sarah Lindquist, who had taken the position in the winter of 2018. The entry started normal, documenting her daily routine, her observations about the building and the weather. Then, around mid-December, they changed. She wrote about hearing footsteps in the empty rooms, about seeing a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the lodge, about a woman's voice calling her name in the middle of the night. The last entry was dated February 14th, 2019. It said, I understand now. She's not in the room. She is the room. She's in the walls, in the floor, in the foundation. They built this place on top of her, and she's been waiting ever since. She wants company. She wants someone to stay with her forever. I can feel her in my head now, showing me things, telling me things. I don't think I'm going to leave. I don't think she'll let me. That was the last entry. Sarah Lindquist had never been seen again. The owners told authorities she'd left her post without notice, that they'd found the lodge empty when they came to check on her in March. No investigation was ever conducted. No one ever found out what happened to her. I ran. I grabbed the journal and my emergency pack, and I ran for the snowmobile, not even stopping to lock the doors behind me. The night was clear and cold, maybe -30, and the snowmobile's engine turned over on the first try. I gunned it down the mountain road, headlight carving a tunnel through the darkness, branches whipping past on either side. I was maybe 2 miles from the lodge when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, a woman in a white nightgown, barefoot in the snow, dark hair hanging loose around a face I couldn't quite see. I swerved to avoid her, and the snowmobile hit a buried rock, and I went flying, tumbling through powder, feeling something crack in my ribs as I hit a tree. I lay there in the snow, stunned, gasping for breath, and watched her walk toward me. She didn't walk like a person. She moved in stutters and jerks, like a film with frames missing, appearing closer and closer, without seeming to cover the distance in between. I tried to get up and couldn't, tried to scream and couldn't. She knelt beside me and I saw her face for the first time, and it was Sarah Lindquist's face, exactly as she'd looked in the photo ID I'd found in the journal, but wrong somehow, stretched and pale and frozen in an expression of terrible longing. She reached out and touched my cheek with fingers that were colder than the snow beneath me. She opened her mouth and she spoke in a voice like wind through empty rooms. She said, "Please stay." She said, "I'm so lonely." She said we could be together forever. I don't know how I got away. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in a hospital in Anchorage with frostbite on my face and hands and a punctured lung from my broken ribs. They told me a Forest Service patrol had found me unconscious beside the road, nearly dead from hypothermia, and airlifted me out. They asked what had happened. I said I'd had an accident on my snowmobile, that I'd gotten lost in the dark. They didn't believe me, I could tell, but they didn't push. I never went back to Whitefall Lodge. I never spoke to Henderson again. I moved to Seattle, got a job doing data entry, tried to build a normal life in a place where the winters were mild and the nights were never completely dark. I don't talk about what happened. I don't tell people about Sarah Lindquist or the room or the thing I saw on that mountain road, but I still have the journal. I keep it locked in a safe deposit box, proof that I'm not crazy, that it really happened, that there's something in that lodge that shouldn't exist. Sometimes late at night, I dream about her, about Sarah or whatever's wearing her face now. She's standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with eyes that don't blink, and she's asking me to come back. She says she's still waiting. She says she'll always be waiting. She says that eventually everyone comes back because the loneliness is too much to bear, because the cold gets inside you and never lets go. I wake up from those dreams shivering, even in my heated apartment, even under 3 blankets. And I know with a certainty that frightens me more than anything else that she's right, that someday the cold will get too deep and I'll find myself driving north, drawn by something I can't explain, following a road that leads back to a locked room on the 3rd floor of an empty lodge. And this time, I won't come back. Story 7. My name is Derek Okonkwo. I'm 44 years old, and I spent 8 years as a diesel mechanic at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica. I did 4 winterovers during that time, which means I was one of maybe 40 people on Earth who spent the polar night at the actual bottom of the world, 2,835 meters up on the Antarctic plateau, 9 months of complete isolation while temperatures dropped to -70 and below. I've seen the aurora australis paint the sky in colors that don't have names. I've felt cold so profound it stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like burning. I've lived through mechanical failures that could have killed everyone on station if we hadn't fixed them in time. I thought I knew what Antarctica was capable of. Then came the winter of 2021, and I learned that the ice holds secrets that should never be disturbed. The station sits at the geographic South Pole, built on stilts above the snow to prevent it from being buried by the annual accumulation. It's a marvel of engineering, completely self-sufficient during the winter months when no flights can land and no supplies can arrive. We generate our own power, produce our own water, maintain our own sanity through a carefully structured routine of work, meals, and social activities. The community is tight-knit by necessity. You learn to trust the people around you because your life depends on them and theirs depends on you. The winterover crew that year was 13 people: scientists, support staff, a doctor, a station manager. I was responsible for keeping the heavy equipment running, the generators turning, the vehicles maintained for the following summer season. It was hard work, but satisfying work, the kind that leaves you tired in your body, but clear in your mind. I was good at it. I'd done it before. I had no reason to expect that this winter would be any different from the previous 3. The first indication that something was wrong came in early May, about 2 weeks into the polar night. One of the atmospheric researchers, a woman named Dr. Priya Mehta, reported anomalies in her data collection equipment. She was studying trace gases in the upper atmosphere, using instruments that could detect particles in concentrations of parts per trillion. Her readings had gone erratic, showing spikes and fluctuations that didn't match any known atmospheric phenomena. She assumed it was equipment malfunction and asked me to check the hardware. I found nothing wrong. The instruments were functioning perfectly, calibrated correctly, protected from the cold exactly as they should be. The anomalies continued. Over the next 2 weeks, they grew more pronounced and more troubling. The spikes began to form patterns, regular intervals that repeated with mathematical precision. Priya showed me her analysis, papers covered in graphs and equations, her face tight with an excitement that was starting to shade into fear. She said the pattern looked like a signal, like something was transmitting. I told her that was impossible. There was nothing at the South Pole except ice and research stations, and all our communications equipment operated on known frequencies that wouldn't affect her instruments. She agreed it was impossible. She also said the data didn't care what was possible. Something was out there, sending something, and her equipment was picking it up. The second indication came a week later. Several people on station started reporting sleep disturbances, vivid dreams, nightmares, episodes of waking in the middle of the night with the unshakable feeling that someone was standing just outside their door. I experienced it myself. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, convinced that I'd heard footsteps in the hallway outside my berth. I'd open the door and find nothing, just empty corridor and the hums of the ventilation system. But the feeling would linger, a presence just out of sight, just beyond the edge of perception. The station doctor, a man named Thomas Chen, attributed it to the usual stresses of polar isolation. We'd all been briefed on the psychological effects of the polar night, the way darkness and confinement could play tricks on the mind. He recommended light therapy, exercise, social activities. We followed his advice. The dreams continued, the presence continued, and then people started seeing things. It was the station manager, a no-nonsense Norwegian woman named Ingrid Helgeson, who first reported a visual encounter. She'd been doing a routine check of the emergency exit corridors, the passages that led to the outside in case of fire or structural failure. She said she'd seen a figure standing at the end of one of the passages, silhouetted against the glow of the emergency lighting. She'd called out, thinking it was one of the crew, and received no response. She'd walked toward the figure, and as she got closer, she realized something was wrong with its proportions. Too tall, too thin, arms that hung past where its knees should have been. She said when she got within 10 meters, it simply wasn't there anymore. One blink and it was gone, like it had never existed. Ingrid was not a woman prone to imagination or hysteria. She'd done 5 winter overs, more than anyone else on station. When she said she'd seen something, people listened. And when others started reporting similar sightings, the mood on station shifted from unease to something closer to fear. I saw it for the first time on June 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year at a place where night lasted months. I was doing a maintenance check on one of the backup generators in an outbuilding about 200 meters from the main station. The building was cold, barely heated, and I was working fast to minimize my exposure time. I just finished replacing a fuel filter when I felt something watching me. I turned around and it was there, standing in the doorway. Tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling that was 3 meters high. Its body was pale and translucent, like ice that had been carved into a roughly human shape, and its face was smooth, featureless, a blank oval where eyes and mouth should have been. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there radiating a cold that was somehow deeper than the Antarctic winter around us, a cold that felt alive, aware, hungry. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I stood there with a wrench in my hand and I stared at it, and it stared at me with that blank face, and I felt it reaching into my mind, probing, searching for something. I felt it find my memories, my fears, my loneliness. I felt it taste my grief over my father's death 2 years earlier, my guilt over the marriage I'd neglected, my shame over the son I barely knew. It fed on those feelings like they were food, and as it fed, I felt myself growing colder, emptier, less myself. Then someone called my name. It was Thomas, the doctor, coming to check on me because I'd been gone too long. His voice broke whatever hold the thing had on me, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a toolbox, making noise that seemed to startle it. The figure flickered like a bad video signal, and then it was gone. Thomas found me on the floor, hyperventilating, unable to explain what had happened. He brought me back to the station and gave me sedatives and sat with me until I fell asleep. The next day we held a meeting, all 13 of us, and we talked about what was happening. Everyone had a story by then. Everyone had seen something or heard something or felt something that couldn't be explained by polar isolation or vitamin D deficiency or any of the other convenient excuses we'd been using. Priya showed us her latest data analysis. The signal had intensified. It was coming from beneath the ice from a location about 3 kilometers from the station at a depth of nearly 1,000 meters. Something down there was broadcasting, had been broadcasting perhaps for millennia, and whatever it was waking up. We debated what to do. Some wanted to contact McMurdo, request an emergency evacuation, but the polar night meant no aircraft could land until September. Some wanted to investigate, to take ground-penetrating radar to the signal source and see what was actually down there. Some wanted to pretend nothing was happening, to batten down the hatches and wait it out and never speak of it again. In the end, the investigation won. Priya and 2 others, a geologist named Marcus Williams and a communications specialist named Lieutenant Amy Foster from the Navy support team, trekked to the signal source with radar equipment and cameras. They were gone for 6 hours. When they came back, Marcus and Amy wouldn't speak. They went straight to their berths and locked the doors and refused to answer when we knocked. Priya came to the common area, sat down across from Ingrid and Thomas and me, and told us what they'd found. The radar had shown a cavity beneath the ice, a pocket of empty space that shouldn't have existed at that depth. In the center of the cavity was something solid, something large, something that had a shape that was almost but not quite architectural. Priya said it looked like a structure, a building or a ship or something in between. She said it had been there for a long time, maybe since before the ice sheet formed, millions of years. She said the signal was coming from inside. She said Amy had insisted on drilling a narrow borehole, just wide enough to lower a camera. They'd done it, against Priya's objections, and they'd watched on a portable monitor as the camera descended through the ice and into the cavity below. She said what they saw on that monitor was something she would never describe, something she wished she could unsee, something that had looked back at the camera with eyes that weren't eyes, and a hunger that transcended human understanding. She said the signal had stopped the moment the camera entered the cavity. Whatever was down there, it had been calling for help, or calling for company, or calling for victims. Now it knew we were here. Now it was coming. That night, the sightings increased exponentially. The figure I'd seen in the generator building appeared in the hallways of the main station, in people's rooms, standing over their beds as they slept. Some people reported being touched, cold hands on their faces, their chests, their throats. Marcus Williams walked out of his berth at 0300 hours, walked down the corridor to the emergency exit, opened the door, and walked outside into -65 temperatures, wearing nothing but his thermals. We found his body 200 meters from the station, frozen solid, face locked in an expression of terrible peace. Amy Foster followed him the next night. Same route, same expression. We couldn't stop her. She was stronger than she should have been, fought off 3 people who tried to hold her back, and we weren't willing to hurt her badly enough to keep her from going. By the end of the first week of July, we were down to 11. Morale had collapsed. People stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped trusting each other. The figure was everywhere now, appearing without warning, reaching into our minds and pulling out our darkest thoughts and showing them to us. It spoke sometimes in voices we recognized. Our parents, our children, our lovers. It promised peace. It promised an end to loneliness. It promised that the cold could take away all the pain, if we just let it in. Ingrid made the call to seal off the emergency exits. We welded them shut, all of them, trapping ourselves inside the station. If the thing couldn't lure us outside, maybe we could survive until September, until the planes could come and take us away from this place. It was a desperate measure, and we knew it might not work, but we didn't know what else to do. I don't want to describe the rest of that winter. I don't want to talk about how we lost 3 more people to the thing in the ice, how we found their bodies inside the station with frost on their skin and that same terrible peace on their faces. I don't want to describe the night Ingrid tried to unseal one of the exits because the thing was wearing her dead husband's face and promising her they could be together again. I don't want to remember Thomas Chen putting a sedative in her coffee to stop her, or the way she looked at him afterward with eyes that weren't quite hers anymore. We made it to September, 8 of us out of 13. The planes came and we evacuated, and we left that station behind, left whatever was frozen beneath it to wait for the next crew, the next winter, the next set of mines to feed on. The official reports said we'd suffered a severe outbreak of polar T3 syndrome, a psychological condition associated with extreme isolation. The deaths were ruled accidents, tragic consequences of mental health crises in an unforgiving environment. No mention was made of the signal, the cavity, the thing beneath the ice. Priya's data was classified. Marcus and Amy's deaths were attributed to disorientation and exposure. Everything was covered up, buried, locked away where no one would ever find it. I left Antarctica after that winter. I took a job at a shipyard in Seattle, as far from the ice as I could get without leaving the country. I tried to put it behind me. I tried to forget. But I still dream about it. The figure, the blank face, the cold that felt alive. I dream about the signal, calling out across millions of years, patient and eternal, waiting for someone to answer. I dream about going back, walking across the plateau to the place where the cavity lies beneath the ice, lowering myself down into that darkness to find whatever's waiting there. Some nights when I wake from those dreams, I feel something watching me from the corner of my room. I feel that cold reaching into my mind, probing, searching, finding the same loneliness it found at the South Pole. And I know with a certainty that I can't explain and can't escape that whatever's down there isn't finished with me yet. The cold has a long memory, and sooner or later, it takes back everything it's owed.